It gives me great pleasure to be at this function and be witness to the grace and elegance with which it was conducted, all the emotions coming straight from the heart. And I congratulate Meenakshi for carrying the legacy forward. It also made me a little thoughtful that I wish all cultures would thus honor the legacy that comes to them from their parents, from their elders. It also, I felt a bit of pain also, because what came to my mind was the legacy of Amrita Pritam, who was one of the foremost poets and also a great writer of prose, and with 100 books to her credit, going through immense struggle. She had one wish. All she had was one house in Delhi, made from her own. The plot given to writers who had come as refugees from Pakistan at subsidized rates, built with her own money and her partner Imrose. And the only wish was that the house stay with the children, but her room where she wrote should be preserved and kept as it is. Within months of Amrita's death, the son did not wait. He sold the house because it had become big property in Delhi, and there was no thought for. He probably did not even realize what he's doing, and it went for some obnoxious sum like 40 crores or whatever. But it was a matter of great pain, and it was a different matter that when I think within a year of selling the house, he died. But it was a matter of pain for all people who knew Amrita or any other writer. In fact, some of them, like film actor Deepti Naval, who also writes in Hindi, said that there is no point of leaving wills. One has to make one's trust and leave it as that. You have a right to keep your legacy, your home, or your books and other things. And I'm very grateful to be called to this prestigious lecture. I do not know if I'm even fully equipped to do it, but I shall make my effort. The theme, as you all know, is Poetics of Protest in India. And, movements, struggle movements and other happenings have always been accompanied by poetry in our culture. If you take it right from early times to our independence movement, where poetry has accompanied struggle across languages, across the languages of the country which is multilingual. And I wish I knew more about Assamese poetry. I would have talked more about it, but I'm sure this visit here will make me reach out in a greater way. But of course, I start my presentation. Lines from a poem from the Northeast define the very spirit and the soul of poetry as protest. Poetry as protest, as we see it unfold in the thousands of years in the Indian subcontinent, which is a long history of differences and dissent. A glimpse of the poem before one goes to the poet. Do not ask me how I have been. After all, I am not alone. For even after the Last Supper, I haven't bid adieu. Nor could I take my leave. I haven't laughed since Auschwitz, nor cried either. These lines by Assam's most cherished living poet, Nilmani Phukan, in translation, are just an amazing way of summing up the political struggles without any element of a slogan or a loudness coming in. Nilmani Phukan, in one fine sweep, using minimal words, takes the reader through a vast canvas of collective experience, from the crucifixion of Christ and the tyranny of the notorious Auschwitz, I hope I pronounce it correct, Meenakshi, concentration camp of Nazi Germany in occupied Poland during World War II, where millions met their end. This poem is a window through which one looks at the long history of protest poetry in the Indian subcontinent in varied tones and tenors to define aesthetics of a culture that has always looked up at the rebels, the poets, the lovers, and the prophets of humankind. Rhythms of resistance. Poetry has always provided rhythms of resistance all over the world, and more so in the ancient civilization of the Indian subcontinent, which has seen thousands of years of poetic resistance, which travels through literature in myriad languages as well as the robust oral culture. This poetic practice, beginning with the ancient era, moving to the medieval times, and prominently present even now, when the popular perception of the poet as a hero was considered lost. But a poet will always rise up to a situation, and that is what we see happening around us. The subcontinent, with its plural tradition and sensibility, has never shied away from differences and arguments. Touching upon the examples of poetic dissent, which is to be found in Vedic hymns and the verses of early classical poets, to the medieval times, which were witness to the Bhakti movement with voices of new thought by many, including Kabir and Guru Nanak. Interestingly, Amartya Sen, the great economist, in his book The Argumentative Indian, points out the hymn of creation in the Rig Veda, which ends with radical doubt. So the hymn goes thus: whence this creation has risen? Perhaps it formed itself, or perhaps it did not. The one who looks down on it, in the highest heaven, only he knows, or perhaps he does not. So, even from early times, the windows of the human mind have not been shut. They question the very existence and creation. Voices of women too have been prominent in different ages, from Akka Mahadevi to Lal Ded and to Mirabai. Since the 1970s and the rise of the women's movement, there have been many women poets across languages who have rewritten the women's history with sensitive poetry, where she claims her share of half the sky. Here I would just like to talk about poetry which accompanies politics. Every movement has a bulk of poetry with it. Political poetry, so also the feminist movement. Not all of it survives the test of time. Which poetry lives on? The poetry which lives on is where the political experience has been felt deeply and internalized and then created. I'm one of the women poets. I don't want to make fun. If I make fun, I make fun of myself too. What we saw during the poems by women writers, you can't blame them because they did not have the kind of exposure and the wherewithal which the male writers had. And they had limited ways of telling a story. And in a myth-heavy country like India, when there's nothing else, it's convenient for us to go back to myth. So, but for some poetry which was genuinely lived and beautifully written, and there are scores of names that one can mention. Otherwise, the tendency was to say loudly, मैं अहल्या नहीं, मैं सीता नहीं, मैं इस तरह नहीं करूँगी, मुझे ये मत समझो, which was poetry which didn't really carry on. But that is bound to happen. Where does, as I said, internalized experience, where poetry becomes a part of the poet and then comes out through her or his experience, her or his emotions, and never as a slogan. We see this in the poetry of the Sufi poets. Sufi Islam, as it evolved in India and the rest of South Asia, saw the great Sufi poets like Amir Khusro, Dara Shikoh, Sheikh Farid, and Bulle Shah. Songs and poems of protest were a celebratory part of the freedom struggle in India. In India today, poetry has accompanied all people's movements, be it poets calling for a more humane order, words uttered against war, or women seeking their rights. Interestingly, in this Bulle Shah, as you all know, was a great Sufi poet who wrote in the Punjabi language. And during this Citizen Amendment Act, we got a poem from one of our very celebrated Punjabi poets, Surjit Patar, winner of many awards and a true poet, one of those born lyrical poets. I don't remember the poem, but the spirit of the poem was that now Bulle Shah is very dear to Punjabis, be they of any religion. The Muslims love him, the Hindu Punjabis love him, the Sikh, he's that kind of a figure. So he said, well, Bulle Shah, if he was now to come to India, he would have to prove that I'm a Punjabi Indian. And then only would he be allowed. And that poem really reached out. When I talk of women writing, I again quote the leading poet from my language, a few lines from the famous poem by Amrita, penned in Punjabi, on the bloodshed during partition and the misery suffered by women and the violence inflicted upon them on both sides of the border. First 4 lines in Punjabi. She called out to the Sufi writer Waris Shah, who had written out the story of one of the love legions. Punjab is famous for its love legions, which are also radical in nature, because those love stories are always tragic, because boy and girl come from feuding clans, or they cannot marry, and yet they fall in love. So they are rewritten by Sufi poets as political poetry. It's political poetry once again. So she took the legend of Heer. Heer Ranjha is the famous love legend of Punjab, which was written by the Sufi poet Waris Shah. And she said, Aj aakhaं Waris Shah nu, kitoo kabਰਾਂ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਬੋਲ, ਤੇ ਅੱਜ ਕਿਤਾਬੇ ਇਸ਼ਕ ਦਾ ਕੋਈ ਅਗਲਾ ਵਰਕਾ ਫੋਲ। ਇੱਕ ਰੋਈ ਸੀ ਤੀ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੀ, ਤੂੰ ਲਿਖ ਲਿਖ ਮਾਰੇ ਵੈਣ, ਅੱਜ ਲੱਖਾਂ ਧੀਆਂ ਰੋਂਦੀਆਂ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਵਾਰਿਸ ਸ਼ਾਹ ਨੂੰ ਕਹਿਣ। I call out to Waris Shah to rise from the grave and open a new page of the book of love. A daughter of Punjab once wept, and you penned many a dirge. A million daughters weep now, and look up to you for solace. Rise and look at your Punjab. Today, corpses haunt the river banks, and the Chenab waters, Chenab is the river, and the Chenab waters are red with blood. You know, this poem was the first poem, because partition for Punjab and Bengal was such a disturbing historical mishap, which I think has not been, people have not, even 3 generations now, have not really been able to recover from it. And there was silence, because the poets of Amrita's time included people like Faiz Ahmad Faiz, Sahir Ludhianvi, and so many others. But there was complete silence. No one knew what to say to what had happened. How do you write? What do you write? How do you justify anyone? And here was Amrita, who gave the first dirge to partition, speaking of love, that where is the love lost? She says the brothers of Ranjha have forgotten the art of love, and today by the mazars, Sufi mazars, you know, the princesses of love are weeping as they bleed. I'd just like to share a little story on how this poem was written. When Amrita and her family moved from Lahore, they could not carry anything with them. They had to flee. So they came in the clothes they were wearing. And Amrita, it was monsoon, had a shawl with her, a red shawl. And they moved to Dehradun, where probably they had some relative or something to start life afresh. And from there, Amrita, with her 2 children, one born in 48 and the other born in, one born in 47 and the other born in 48. A year after, I think, being in Dehradun, she was traveling to Delhi. She had been an All India radio announcer in Lahore to look for a job. And when she was returning by the night train she recounts it, her autobiography. When she was returning in the night train to Dehradun, it was dark. She had cut her shawl, the red shawl, and covered both her children with half a piece of the shawl each. And you know, it was dark and life was dismal, and she could see, you know, in the dark, the shade of the sight of tall trees almost weeping. And it was then that these lines came to her. What happened after this poem, even her detractors say that but for this poem there was not much to her. What happened after this poem, that of course this part of the country it was published. It was also taken by someone to Pakistan and published in the Urdu Shahmukhi, they call it, script in Punjabi. And Faiz Ahmad Faiz recounts that he read the poem in the prison. He was imprisoned being a left-wing poet. And he was touched by it, but when he came out, he found that ordinary people had the poem in their pockets and they would read and weep that this is what has happened. So sometimes political poetry can scale great heights. Now for a little light, 7+ decades have passed since this poem was written. Now, women poets have built a strong tradition of contemporary poetry of modern India. Poets have voiced issues, not just those concerning them, but the society at large. Here I succumb to a poet's temptation of reading one of my poems, which, like my friend from Guwahati, Rajiv Barua's poem, was included by Gulzar in his, a poem a day translation. It's called The Wicked Woman. And it is dedicated to all wicked women. If you come to my city, you are bound to find my name in the roster of wicked women. I have all that it takes to be as wicked as they come. I have a goblet brimming over in my hand. My laughter is known for its abandon. Flames find a home in my mouth. My heart beats and every nerve does a little dance. The road is at my feet and just the sky above. I have the courage to bear and express myself sans fear. Now I come to the liberating power of words. Recent times have shown words exercising their power to liberate and take people away from the fear of freedom of expression. There has been a time in which people have been silent, afraid to say anything, also bullied to some extent by followers of a certain way of thought. Here I will recite another short poem from a Punjab Dalit poet, Lal Singh Dil. Words. Words have been uttered long before us and will be long after we are gone. Chop off every tongue if you can, but the words will still have been uttered. So it is a celebration by words when they come up to a time when they are most needed. Once again, the verses of radical poets of the 20th century are invoked, like Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Sahil Ludhiani, and many more. At times, it leads to many muddles, as by half-baked interpretation. Surprisingly, during the protests for CEA protests, students of IIT Kanpur recited the famous poem by Faiz, Hum Dekhenge. And there was such a noise after that because someone put in a complaint that this poem is against Hindu thought, which it was not. It was a poem attacking martial law in Pakistan, written long after partition, and it attacked the clergy of Pakistan, the mullahs, who had supported the martial law regime. In these times, we have also seen the rise of young poets, rising from among engineers and technocrats. Pertinent were the poems of Hussain Haidari and Amar Aziz. In fact, Amar Aziz's poem, Sab Yaad Rakha Jayega, It Will Be Remembered, was recited internationally at a protest forum by Roger Waters, who was the founding partner of the famous music band Pink Floyd and also its guitarist. And that poem was written after the Shaheen Bagh protest was suppressed and there were riots. I had the poem with me. Yes, 2-3 lines in original and then the translation. He was not a poet, but the circumstances made him choose the path of a performance poet, otherwise a student of civil engineering with a degree from Jamia Millia. The poem was "Sab yaad rakha jayega, सब कुछ याद रखा जाएगा, हम पर हमला करके हमें हमलावर कहना, तुम रात लिखो हम चांद लिखेंगे, तुम हमें कत्ल कर दो बन के भूत लिखेंगे, तुम्हारे कत्ल के सारे सबूत लिखेंगे." It says, "Kill us, we will become ghosts and write of your killings. With all the evidence, you write jokes in court, and we will write justice on the walls. We will speak so loudly that even the deaf will hear. We will write so clearly, even the blind will read. You write injustice on the walls, we will write revolution in the sky. Everything will be remembered, everything recorded. तुम दीवारों पे झूठ लिखो, आसमान पर इनकलाब लिखेंगे." So this is when any person is pushed to a point, poetry comes to his or her aid. Another poem which became very popular in these times was by another engineer and a lyricist in films called Hussain Haidari. I don't have the poem with me, but I'll just share what it said. He spoke that he is, what kind of a Musliman is he? What kind of a Muslim is he? Is he Haji or is he a Khoja? Is he Peer? Then he goes on to say, "Mujh mein Gita ka saar bhi hai." That the elements, the crux of Gita lives within. "Mujh mein Gita ka saar bhi hai, ek Urdu ka akhbar bhi hai." "Mujh mein Gita ka saar bhi hai, Urdu ka akhbar bhi hai. मेरा एक महीना रमज़ान है, किया तो मैंने गंगा स्नान भी है, मैं कैसा मुसलमान हूँ?" Then he replies that मैं हिंदुस्तानी मुसलमान हूँ, asserting that this is my creed, I am an Indian Muslim, because we have seen times where say a word, even if anyone, a non-Muslim says a word, that this is not correct, this should not be done, the reply at once is, "Go to Pakistan." And you are trolled on social media, "Go to Pakistan. If you think like this, go to Pakistan." So, who can send who to Pakistan? That is what one wonders. And next we come, which I have been closely witness to, the farmers' protest in Punjab. The farmers' protest started in a very peaceful manner as a protest that they were not ready for these new farm laws, and whatever their fears, but they felt that they will undermine us. So for once the Punjabis, when we say the Punjabis, of course, it's the Sikhs we talk about, because they are basically the farmers, they are the tillers of the land. And for once they had restraint is not very much a part of the Punjabi culture, be it Sikh or especially Sikh or Hindu, but for once it was very peacefully carried on, with poetry, with songs, with these tractor trolleys joined together and a tent put on top, and films being screened, and a newspaper called Trolley Times being brought out. So such was the spirit of the protest. And then we all know what happened and how it went into troubled times. But also one thing, it is said that when the government, when people are afraid of the government, there is tyranny. When the government is afraid of the people, there is liberty. So, in a way, the government showed such fear. And in fact, there was a beautiful article today which Meenakshi shared with me, Hope at the End of the Tunnel, in which the courts hold a different opinion to what the government says about a toolkit. I was surprised what a toolkit is. I thought it's something as dangerous as the AK-47 gun or something. So anything you put on the in media, on all this internet is a toolkit. And the situation came to such a pass that 18, 19-year-old, climate change popular activist becomes a threat. A pop artist like Rihanna becomes a threat. A 22-year-old girl, Disha in Bangalore, becomes the greatest villain who has taken part with the Khalistani movement and put a toolkit, So the court has made observations which are different from that. And I hope that some of you will share with me. I have been exposed a little to the Mia poetry of Assam at one or two events in the north, and women's poetry coming, and I believe there is a tradition of tea garden poetry by the tea garden workers. So I would like to be enlightened on this, and I hope I've been able to convey my thoughts to you, and thank you very much.